You are driving over the dead. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Physically. Right now, beneath the roads, parks, and parking lots of at least 28 major American cities, there are human remains that were never moved. Bones sitting 6 feet under asphalt that gets repaved every decade, while no one mentions what's underneath. In Chicago alone, an estimated 12,000 bodies remain beneath Lincoln Park, the park where people jog, where children play, where tourists take photographs of the skyline. It was a cemetery until 1869. The city said they moved the bodies. They moved some of them. They left the rest. And Chicago isn't unusual. It's just the one that got caught. I came to this research through a different question. I was tracing property records in Lower Manhattan, trying to understand why certain blocks had unusual deed restrictions, clauses that prohibited excavation below a certain depth. The kind of clause you'd find on a former industrial site, except these weren't industrial sites. They were residential blocks, expensive ones, and the restrictions dated to the 1850s. When I found out what was beneath those blocks, I understood the restrictions, and I started looking at every other major American city. What I found made me rethink what the word city actually means. Let me tell you what happened in Chicago, because it's the best documented case, and because what happened there happened everywhere. In 1835, Chicago was a town of 3,200 people. By 1850, it was a city of nearly 30,000. By 1870, almost 300,000. That kind of growth doesn't just strain infrastructure. It buries it. And in Chicago's case, the thing it buried was its dead. The city's first public cemetery was established in 1835 on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, in an area then considered far from the town center. It was called City Cemetery. Within 15 years, the city had grown around it. Homes stood across the street from headstones. Markets opened within sight of fresh graves. The living and the dead were neighbors, separated by nothing but a low fence. By the 1850s, the situation had become what the Chicago Tribune called a nuisance of the gravest character. Health officials blamed the cemetery for contaminating the city's water supply. Lake Michigan, which provided Chicago's drinking water, sat less than a quarter mile from thousands of decomposing bodies in shallow graves on sandy soil. Doctors linked outbreaks of cholera and typhoid to the cemetery's proximity to the lake. In 1858, Chicago physician Dr. John Rauch published a report arguing that the cemetery was a direct threat to public health. The city council agreed. In 1859, they officially closed City Cemetery to new burials and ordered all bodies to be removed. The order was clear. The execution was not. Removal was the responsibility of individual families. The city would not pay to move the dead. If families wanted their relatives relocated to one of the new suburban cemeteries, Graceland, Rose Hill, Oakwoods, Calvary, they had to arrange and fund the disinterment themselves. Some families did. Thousands didn't. Not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford it, couldn't be located, or had themselves moved away or died. The city set a deadline. When the deadline passed, they set another one, then another. For over a decade, the cemetery existed in a state of bureaucratic limbo. Some plots were emptied. Others were left. New construction began encroaching on the cemetery grounds, even as bodies remained in the soil. In 1869, the city redesignated the cemetery land as a public park. They named it Lincoln Park, after the recently assassinated president. Landscapers graded the earth, planted trees, laid paths. a beautiful park emerged over ground that still contained thousands of bodies. The Chicago History Museum, which sits inside Lincoln Park today, acknowledges this history plainly. Their records indicate that removal efforts were incomplete, and that an unknown number of interments, estimated between 10,000 and 12,000, were never relocated. In 1998, during construction of a parking structure near the Chicago History Museum, workers unearthed human remains. In 2008, more remains were found during infrastructure work near North Avenue. In 2010, archaeologists discovered a fully intact burial during a water main installation. Each time, the same sequence: discovery, brief news coverage, quiet reburial, continued construction. No comprehensive survey has ever been conducted to determine the full extent of remaining interments beneath Lincoln Park. You can walk there today. You can jog the lakefront path. You can sit on the grass with a book and a coffee. And beneath you, 12,000 people who lived in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s are exactly where their families left them, under soil that was regraded, replanted, and renamed so that no one would remember they were there. If Chicago were the only case, this would be a local curiosity. It isn't. San Francisco. In 1900, the city passed an ordinance banning all burials within city limits. By 1912, they began forcibly relocating cemeteries to the town of Colma, 12 miles south, which today has a population of roughly 1,800 living residents and an estimated 1.5 million dead, the only incorporated town in America where the dead outnumber the living by nearly 1,000 to 1. But the removals were chaotic. The San Francisco Call reported in 1901 that bones were being handled with no more care than old bricks. Headstones were repurposed as construction material, used as breakwaters along Ocean Beach, as paving stones in Buena Vista Park, as gutter linings in the Richmond district. You can still see them. Fragments of gravestones embedded in seawalls. Names and dates worn smooth by a century of tides, but still legible if you know where to look. The bodies beneath were handled worse. Workers hired by the city were paid per coffin removed, which incentivized speed over thoroughness. In neighborhoods that are now the Inner Richmond and the Inner Sunset, construction projects have repeatedly turned up human remains in 1993, 2006, 2011, and as recently as 2016, when a homeowner renovating a backyard unearthed a small coffin containing the remains of a child. Her name, based on the coffin plate, was Edith Howard Cook. She had died in 1876 at the age of 2. She had been buried in Odd Fellows Cemetery. The cemetery was cleared in the 1930s. Edith was left behind. Atlanta. Oakland Cemetery, founded in 1850, was the city's primary burial ground during the Civil War. After the war, the city expanded rapidly around it. Today, it remains a functioning cemetery, but portions of the original burial ground extend beneath adjacent streets and properties that were developed in the 1880s and 1890s. The city's own archaeological surveys have documented burials outside the current cemetery boundaries. New York. This is where the scale becomes difficult to comprehend. The African Burial Ground, rediscovered in 1991 during construction of a federal office building at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, contained the remains of approximately 15,000 people of African descent, buried between the 1690s and 1794. For 2 centuries, The most important African-American archaeological site in the United States sat beneath a parking lot and then a commercial building. No marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement that an estimated 15,000 human beings lay under the foundation. The discovery happened by accident. Construction crews hit bone. Archaeologists were called. Excavation revealed 419 intact burials before the project's footprint was exhausted. The remaining estimated 14,500 bodies were left in place, beneath the streets and buildings of Lower Manhattan, where they remain today. But the African burial ground is just the one we know about. Manhattan is an island that has been continuously inhabited for over 400 years. Burial grounds were established, filled, forgotten, and built over in every era. The Collect Pond Burial Ground, the Negroes' Burial Ground, the burial vaults beneath dozens of churches that were themselves demolished centuries ago. Washington Square Park was a potter's field, a burial ground for the unidentified poor, from 1797 to 1826. An estimated 20,000 bodies remain beneath the park. In 2015, during routine water main work on Washington Square South, workers found human remains. Again, the same pattern. Discovery, brief coverage, quiet reburial, continued construction. Philadelphia, Savannah, Boston, New Orleans, St. Louis. The list doesn't end because the practice didn't end. Every American city that experienced rapid growth in the 19th century faced the same problem. The dead were in the way of the living, and every city solved it the same way. Move what you can. Pave over what you can't. Stop talking about it. Here is where something shifts from disturbing to structural. I spent weeks looking for the legal framework that allowed this to happen. How do you build a park over 12,000 bodies? How do you turn a graveyard into a parking lot? What law says that's acceptable? The answer is uncomfortable. There is no single law. There is an absence. In the 19th century, the legal concept of perpetual burial rights, the idea that a grave is permanent, was not consistently recognized in American law. Cemetery plots were often sold as revocable licenses rather than permanent deeds. The land belonged to the city, the church, or the cemetery corporation. You purchased the right to use a specific plot. That right could be revoked if the cemetery was abandoned, if the governing body dissolved, or if the city determined a superseding public interest. Public health was the superseding interest that justified most cemetery relocations. Once a city health board declared a cemetery a threat to public sanitation, legal authority to relocate, or simply close, the cemetery was established. The bodies themselves occupied an extraordinary legal gray zone. They were not property in the conventional sense. They could not be owned. But they also couldn't be simply abandoned by the governing authority. In practice, what happened was delegation to the vanishing point. The city orders removal. Removal is delegated to families. Families who cannot be found or cannot pay are given deadlines. Deadlines pass. The city declares the matter resolved. Construction begins. Each step is legal. Each step is documented. Each step creates the appearance of diligence. And the cumulative result is 12,000 bodies under a park, 20,000 under a public square, 15,000 under a city block. Not through malice, through process. And the process has a companion: deed restrictions. Those clauses I found in Manhattan prohibiting excavation below certain depths, exist in cities across America. They are not listed as burial-related restrictions. They are filed as standard land use provisions. Unless you know to look for them, and unless you know what they mean, you would never connect a depth restriction on a residential property to the fact that there are human remains beneath the foundation. I asked a real estate attorney in Chicago whether buyers are legally required to be informed if their property sits on former cemetery land. The answer was no, not specifically, unless remains are known to be present on the specific parcel. A park built over a cemetery is not the same, legally, as a house built over a grave. Even if the cemetery's boundaries once extended to where the house now stands. The dead have no legal standing to object, and the living are not required to be told. I need to say something carefully here, because I know the territory I'm entering. The Great Chicago Fire of October 8, 1871, destroyed 17,400 buildings across 2,100 acres of the city. The fire started on the southwest side and burned northeast, driven by strong winds, through the most densely built sections of Chicago. Lincoln Park, the former cemetery, sits on the north side. The fire reached the southern edge of the park, but did not burn through it. The park, in a grim irony, served as a refuge for thousands of residents fleeing the flames. But the fire destroyed something else entirely. City records, property deeds, cemetery registries, the documents that recorded who was buried where, which families had been notified, which plots had been cleared, and which had not. The Cook County Courthouse, which housed the city's property records, burned completely. The records of City Cemetery, the administrative documents tracking the incomplete removal process, were among the losses. After the fire, Chicago rebuilt with extraordinary speed. The city we know today was largely constructed in the 2 decades following 1871. And it was constructed on top of whatever was already there, including the remains that had never been moved and whose records had just burned. The same night, October 8, 1871. Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Holland, Michigan. Manistee, Michigan. Fires erupted simultaneously across the Great Lakes region. The Peshtigo fire alone consumed 1.2 million acres and killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people. I am not going to tell you what caused the simultaneous fires. I have explored that question in a previous investigation, and the evidence remains inconclusive. What I will tell you is what those fires destroyed beyond buildings and lives. Records. In every affected city, the same category of document was lost. Property records, cemetery records, census data, church registries, the paper trail that connects land to names and names to graves. In a city where the cemetery records have burned, and the census records have burned, and the church registries have burned, who can prove that a body buried in 1855 was or wasn't moved in 1867? Who can prove that the park built in 1869 was or wasn't fully cleared? Who can verify any of it? No one. That's the answer. No one can verify it. And in the absence of verification, the assumption becomes the record. The city said it moved the bodies. The records that might contradict that statement burned. And for a century and a half, the assumption held, until construction crews hit bone. I keep returning to the 1890 census, not because it explains everything, but because its destruction makes everything harder to explain. The 1890 census was the most detailed population survey ever conducted in the United States. For the first time, each household received its own dedicated form. It recorded the address of every family, the name of every person in the household, their relationship to the head of household, their occupation, their place of birth, and, critically, their property ownership status. 63 million Americans, documented with unprecedented precision during the exact decade when cemetery relocations were at their peak, when cities were expanding over former burial grounds at the fastest rate in American history. The 1890 census would have mapped, household by household, who was living on former cemetery land. It would have recorded whether the residents knew. It would have created an indelible record of which city blocks had been cleared and which had been quietly paved over. That census was destroyed. Fire in 1921. 12 years of neglect. Congressional authorization for destruction in 1933. One day before the cornerstone was laid for the fireproof National Archives building. Of 63 million records, roughly 6,160 survive. I am not saying the census was destroyed because of the cemeteries. I am saying that among the thousands of things the 1890 census would have revealed, the precise location of every American family living over unmarked graves is one of them, and that capacity for revelation no longer exists. Sometimes I pause and force myself to consider the simplest version of this story. Cities grow. Cemeteries get in the way. Moving bodies is expensive and unpleasant. Some bodies get left behind. Records are lost to fire and negligence. Construction happens. Nobody checks what's underneath because checking is expensive and the answers are inconvenient. Not conspiracy. Not erasure. Just the ordinary indifference of a civilization that values the living more than the dead and values real estate more than both. Maybe that's all this is, the mundane cruelty of development, the bureaucratic shrug that says good enough when good enough means 12,000 people under a jogging path. Maybe. But the pattern doesn't care whether I find it convenient. And the pattern is this. There is a website maintained by genealogical researchers that maps known and suspected former cemetery sites in American cities. It is not comprehensive. It cannot be, because the records are incomplete. But what it shows is striking. In Chicago, at least 28 former cemetery sites have been identified within the modern city limits. Many are now residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, public parks. Most have no marker, no memorial, no indication that the ground was once consecrated for the dead. In San Francisco, the number is at least 30. In Manhattan, at least 25 mapped burial sites, most of them predating 1800, sit beneath the modern street grid. In Philadelphia, in Boston, in every city old enough to have buried its first generation and then built over them, the ground holds what the records don't. And this is only what we know. The mapped sites are the ones where records survived, where archaeologists have confirmed remains, where construction accidentally revealed what was underneath. The unmapped sites, the cemeteries whose records burned in the fires of the 1870s, whose removal was ordered but never verified, whose existence was forgotten before anyone thought to document it. Those are still there, under your street, under your park, under the foundation of your house. I think about the people beneath Lincoln Park. 12,000 of them. Immigrants, mostly. Irish and German families who arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, who survived the crossing, who built lives in a new city, who died of cholera or typhoid or simple exhaustion, and who were buried by families who believed the grave was permanent. They were promised rest. They were given a park. Their headstones were removed. Their names were filed away in documents that burned 20 years later. Their descendants, if they could be found, were given a deadline and a bill. And when the deadline passed and the bill went unpaid, the city planted grass over them and named the park after Abraham Lincoln and never mentioned it again. Today, runners pass over them every morning. Cyclists ride above them every afternoon. In summer, families spread blankets on the grass and watch the sun set over the lake. And beneath the blanket, beneath the grass, beneath the topsoil that was brought in to smooth the landscape, the bones are still there. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. The city knows. The records that survived confirm it. The construction discoveries prove it. And every time a backhoe hits bone, the same ritual repeats. Discovery, brief coverage, quiet reburial, continued construction. Nobody stops building. Nobody conducts a comprehensive survey. Nobody asks the question that 12,000 people deserve to have answered. Who are they? Where exactly are they? And does anyone alive still carry their name? The 1890 census might have told us. But the 1890 census burned. The cemetery records might have told us. But the cemetery records burned. The church registries might have told us. But the church registries burned. And so the dead remain where the living left them, beneath the roads we drive on every day, beneath the parks where our children play, beneath the foundations of buildings whose owners don't know and aren't required to be told. The ground remembers what the records don't. The bones preserve what the documents erased. And somewhere beneath every American city old enough to have buried its dead and then forgotten where it put them, the longest cemetery in America stretches from coast to coast, invisible, unmarked, and directly under your feet. You drove over it this morning. You'll drive over it tomorrow, and unless someone stops paving and starts looking, you will never know whose name is written in the ground beneath you. The dead don't need headstones to be there. They just need someone willing to stop and ask what's underneath. No one is asking.